As promised, I have important voices to decode what could be the way forward. What can India do? The bilateral treaty, the talks that are currently on, will that ensure that India remains insulated or at least is able to cushion some of the impact from this uncertainty? Let me now get in Alicia Garci Herrero, who's joining me to talk more about what could be the way forward. She's joining me from Paris. She's the Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at the French investment bank Natixis. Alicia, good to have you on the show. And let me start by asking you the fact that, right now, as I said, and I started the show as well with the fact that we are talking on the eve of when those tariffs will actually kick in. You want to weigh in on the fact that what is it that we should prepare ourselves for, or what is it that the world should prepare itself for?
Well, I mean, tariffs on China are coming on the 9th, but there may be negotiations with other countries. So what we really know is that China will basically face humongously high tariffs that will not allow China to export to the US directly. Other channels like Vietnam, which is extremely important for China, with around 600 billion in a trade surplus with the US, much of which around 60% is Chinese related, might open up if negotiations between Vietnam and the US come to fruit. But this is not yet sure. Actually, it's still unlikely because we've not seen major actions yet being taken by the Vietnamese government.
Indeed, Vietnam is one aspect of it. But Curtis, let me ask you on one interesting development that's taken place, which is the fact that within the Team Trump, there is difference of opinion as to what these trade tariffs are meant to accomplish. Do you think that gives you hope that maybe some of this could actually unwind sooner than we think?
You know, it's really unclear. I mean, the reality is when we think about what is going on in the Trump administration, there is one decider. It's the president. And the reality, in many ways, he's driving this global agenda. And remember, I think he's only been in, 75 days or so. But very clearly, there is some disagreement between, almost like the more traditional people, probably that study the same economics that you and I study, and others who are saying, well, is this a sea change and a necessary sea change to address persistent deficits between nations? It's also fascinating that we always focus, of course, on the goods, the trading goods trade deficits. The reality is the United States has a services surplus with many nations around the world, and overall, you add it all up, the U.S. has a services surplus. So, the world of trade is changing, but still we're looking at things through these old prisms of the goods trade deficit. But very clearly, countries are already trying to work around things that have been imposed in the past. As you just noted,
yes.
Chinese companies are exporting now via Vietnam. And now what will Vietnam do when they realize part of one reason that this is happening to them and why they were ranked so high on that list is because of the use of that nation by Chinese companies to, again, send products to the U.S. Where will those products go if they cannot go to the U.S. or Europe from Vietnam? Those are the key questions I think all these other countries are trying to
find answers to. Yes. And Alicia, let me ask you this. You mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned some of the other Asian economies. They suffered their worst yesterday since the Asian crisis. I have to ask you this, that, what do you think that they could do to be able to find some sort of a balance between what Trump's demands are and their own trade concerns?
So you use the right word, Gaurie, trade balance. So this is what Trump wants. He wants a balanced trade between any nation in the world and the US. This is very difficult, in some degrees impossible to reach. And also because if the US were to have a fully balanced trade, it would not import capital to finance its trade deficit. So there's a lot of things that he might not like eventually from a balanced trade with every country in the world. But because so far this is the objective, Asian nations need to try to balance its trade. I think if they can't, which many will not, Vietnam is the best example. I think they need to open their markets to to US companies. So In other words, market access.
Is that what it is, Curtis? So simple, 2 words, market access. The world is going round and round and not able to understand?
Certainly that's clearly a key part of it. And again, as I said earlier, I think in India, in the US, in whatever nation, we in those countries know best how open our markets are, how expensive that American car is or how expensive that American phone is. We ourselves know the reality of the situation when we try and buy products or services from elsewhere. But I think one solution, and I think we're even seeing it out, I think earlier you talked about the meeting between the leadership of, say, the UAE and India, is will there be efforts to push for greater and what we call South-South cooperation? And part of that will include, will countries like China and others encourage domestic consumption versus driving their economies through exports? So again, I think the reality, it's just not the US that needs to evolve. So when we look at all these countries around the world and how they have grown in this generally very peaceful times, how do they need to evolve, given that this has been now the reaction from the US to the present situation?
Okay, then Alicia, let me ask you the one word that everybody wants an answer to. And I think many people believe that it's actually just the China factor. Everything else is just collateral damage. These Liberation Day tariffs are all about countering China when it comes to Donald Trump.
It is the main target. It is very clear by now. The fact that China retaliated nobody else did. Now Europe is announcing 25% tariffs, so Europe might retaliate at nearly the same level. We'll see what happens. If Trump does the same thing with Europe as he did with China, i.e. an additional 50% tariffs, maybe I will say China is not targeted. But so far, I feel China is the target.
Curtis, you want to come in there, sir? That this is just about countering China and Vietnam and every other country is because of that extension.
Clearly a lot of this is about China, but it isn't just about China. And again, as we think about trade flows, the reality is China has grown wealthy through the present system. Now that system is under threat. How will China react? That is a key question I think everyone is figuring out. And remember, how we began, we talked about each of these presidents are playing to a domestic audience. The reality is that
mentioned this is not about China. I'm running out of time. I have a question to ask you, which is that if you say this is not just, about a simple trade war, explain to me, or, this is a scenario that some people believe is possible, which is that if, both sides have hardened their positions, if China is able to get more of US's trading partners on its side, would that then force Donald Trump to back down? Let's say the EU comes on its side, Japan comes on its side.
My gut is that won't happen. And the reality, whenever I'm on your and other shows in India, I'm really the optimist, and maybe always the outlier optimist. But I think this can ultimately lead to some positive change in our situation. I just came back from Hong Kong, our first Milken event in Korea. I was just in Saudi Arabia. All of them suffer from challenging headlines. But I would say to people, whether it's China or the US or India, visit those places and see firsthand what is going on and the reality that businesses and everyday consumers face. And hopefully that will contribute to companies coming together to move things forward. And hopefully keeping this, not just a trade war, but keeping it to a more peaceful situation. I think Donald Trump, maybe it's fake news, once said, I don't like war, but maybe trade war, there's a method to all this madness. But let's hope this will lead to positive change.
I do hope that there is some method to that madness, and I think that's the only optimistic note I'm going to end this on. Curtis and Alicia, thank you so much for joining me on India Global today. And viewers, bottom line really is that tariff announcements is, well, classic Trump playbook, where geopolitics and economics go hand in hand. The division in Team Trump shows that the unsustainability of these high tariffs is known to those in the system as well. But these will probably mark the beginning of trade talks. 50 nations, no less, who want to speak with Donald Trump to cut better deals. And this is exactly what President Trump wants, or at least that's what his electorate wants. More favorable trade deals for America. But the risk here is that if China and a few other large trading blocs like the European Union do come together for a hard bargaining against these tariffs, will that change things? And I guess that's the unpredictability, which is really the real turmoil in global trade right now.